Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.
Good afternoon and welcome to Radio Show 163, the death of the annual engagement survey. So today we are going to be talking about annual employee surveys, or rather asking whether we're seeing the death of them, and if so, what are organisations doing instead? So I'm Jo Dodds, your host for today. I'm a social engagement consultant working with the Engage for Success movement leading on digital. The Engage for Success movement is an inclusive movement committed to the idea that there's a better way to work by releasing more of the capability and potential of people at work. We spread the word about employee engagement and shine a light on good practice, and we're widely supported across the UK, involving the public, private and third sectors. If you go to engageforsuccess.org, our website, you can use the link at the top of the page to join our newsletter list. We send a newsletter out every Friday. And if you tweet, please share your thoughts using our hashtag, which is #E4S, that's like the number 4. And come and join us in our LinkedIn groups to continue the discussion. All our social media links are at the top of our homepage. And if you do enjoy the shows, I'd really appreciate if you could go over to iTunes and leave a review on our iTunes profile. That would be really helpful. So my guest today is Peter Wilde, who's Managing Director and Founder at Employee Research. So welcome, Peter.
Oh, hi, Jo. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here. I can't tell whether there's an echo or if it's just a bit noisy on my phone, so I do apologise if people are getting some interference, but we will continue. So
Okay.
Start by telling us a bit about yourself, Peter, and some of your experience.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I've spent the last 20 years in the employee engagement world, which was quite worrying when you think about it, that I've been completely obsessed with
You
that.
don't sound old enough, Peter. You must have a young voice.
That's very kind. Must have been the gin you've been drinking this afternoon. No, I've been doing this stuff for 20 years, and it's pretty much all I've ever done. So straight out of uni, I worked at Ipsos Mori, where they gave you an option of different types of research to do, and I was just always attracted to employee engagement and employee research. So I ploughed straight on with that, and I was really fortunate actually, and kind of learned the trade there, did employee engagement and employee research stuff for the BBC and Coca-Cola and Cadbury's and companies like that. And then went on, after a few years there, I went on to head up employee engagement at UBS, the global mega bank. So that was really interesting because that moved away from the agency side to moving to the client side, where I stayed for the next 10 or 15 years, I guess. God, I am sounding old now. And so I headed up employee engagement at UBS, and then Unilever was my most recent role. So I've kind of sat mainly client side, listening to pitches from employee engagement organisations, and seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've kind of seen it all. So that's kind of my corporate background. I think after a while of not becoming disillusioned, but after a while of seeing everything that there was on to offer, I kind of did and continue to question the validity of kind of annual surveys. And figured that I could do something better. So about 4 years ago, I quit and started up my own company, trying to get all the good bits of research that people were doing, but move away to being something a bit more useful.
So let's explore a bit how things sort of were in the past, how they've been. So we've talked or mentioned already the whole concept of annual surveys. How have organisations in the past found out this information? I guess you've experienced a number of different routes through the experience that you've had.
Yeah, so obviously, Jo, you're an expert on employee engagement. I guess the question is, how do we measure employee engagement? I think the reality is that every academic institute, every organisation, every company, research company has their own definition. Obviously, the Engage for Success group's been doing a great job of trying to bring all that together the nailing the evidence piece, which I did some work on years ago, did some good stuff towards that. But the reality is that when you sit on the inside of a company and you see the beauty parade of organisations that come out and present to you, they all have similar but different notions of what employee engagement is. So that's the first kind of problematic starting point. And then the next part is, how do you measure it? And traditionally, of course, that would be measured by a battery of questions in an annual employee survey. Lots of organisations still do that, but in the past, pretty much every large organisation did that. And I think the time was right to question whether or not that was the best way of doing things.
I guess there's lots of reasons for that as well. I mean, just thinking back to the surveys originally, as you say, the X number of questions, it was generally very paper-based because there wasn't really any other option. And so sort of the world has moved on in actually measuring engagement in the first place, but also with technology, hasn't it? So I guess that some of that's inevitable, and some of it is because perhaps the surveys haven't worked, or perhaps the resolution after the surveys perhaps isn't working so well.
Yeah, I mean,
about that.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I guess there are three things that have changed. You're absolutely right. The first is technology. Obviously, technology has changed massively. If you saw some of the amusing, antiquated, paper-based processes that I used to use in the 90s, you would cower in fear and horror. Obviously, the move over to online surveys is a huge leap, and then I guess more recently, as you say, technology has completely changed everything. Obviously, we've moved to having things like having apps and having real-time research and always-on feedback, and that's, I think, obviously that's a welcome move and that's a positive move, and that absolutely needed to change. I guess there were kind of dangers to that as well, in terms of kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. I think the second thing that's changed. The second thing that's changed in the last few years as well, I guess, is a growing realization that a little bit like annual appraisals, there's a sense that when it comes to annual surveys or surveys every 2 years, they're expensive, they're hugely time consuming. Nobody particularly likes doing them. They're kind of often thrown at an HR person as a project to do. And sometimes, if they're not done well, then they can often do more harm than good. I think especially you're right to pick up on the issue of surveys not being followed up on. And that happened all too often. I often, wax lyrical with colleagues about whether or not what we were doing actually had any purpose sometimes. Sometimes they're being done really well, but often they weren't. And I guess the third thing is that expectations from people have changed. So with the workforce being younger and Generation Y now being the largest demographic in the workforce, and they're much more tech savvy and they're much more used to having their say, instantly on everything from Uber to Airbnb or retweeting, and this notion of kind of constant feedback extends to the workplace. They're no longer just prepared to sit down and work and be asked what they think every 2 years. That's just a different world now, and I think a lot of organisations are changing to much more frequent forms of employee insight and feedback.
Yeah, and I guess it's not always all three for every organisation. I suppose in some cases things like the technology are driving it, because you sometimes get people implementing tools because it's a tool rather than because they've thought through the sort of need for it. And as you say, with the annual surveys being expensive and time consuming, you can see why people would want to do something different potentially. So lots of different organisations changing for different reasons. So sort of talk us a bit through how things have changed for you, so the experiences you've had and what you're now doing, how you're measuring things differently. Sure.
Okay. I mean, I've noticed the trends in the industry, I suppose, having built up contacts and friends within all the big agencies. I mean, talking about how software's changing things, technology's changing things. I remember 2 years ago, the CEO of one of the biggest companies, said to me, because I was speaking to him about this trend, will we see the death of the annual survey? Will we move towards, always on feedback and that kind of stuff? And he said to me, well, oh yes, he said, let me guess, there's a software supplier out there that has all of the answers and is going to sweep everything away with their new tool or their new gadget or their new their new shiny app, or whatever. There's an extent to which that's true. I can see what he was saying, but I also think the flip side of that is the large agencies in the industry. Let's have a look at how they're getting on. Okay, so a lot of the big contracts with big global organisations for annual surveys for that kind of research just aren't happening anymore. And I think the large agencies have realised that, and a lot of them have either folded, been bought by other organisations, or have stripped out their employee survey teams, or limited the extent to which they market their annual employee surveys. So it's a definite trend in the industry. It's just a really interesting time because it's a question of, what's going to replace that.
Mm.
How are we going to measure engagement? People, businesses, some of it through the work that you guys have done, are much more understanding and comprehending of the concept of employee engagement, how it feeds into business, into profit, and all that good stuff. But how do you measure it in a meaningful and insightful way in an organisation? That's what's being tossed around now.
Yeah, and how do you then do something with it? It's interesting. I was at a conference a year or so ago, and people from the NHS were talking about their survey being quarterly and how they thought it was too quick and they couldn't make the changes that they needed to make to improve before the next one came around. My background was retail, and we used to have quarterly surveys in a very big retail organisation, and it actually worked incredibly well. And I don't remember us ever saying they came around too often because it actually worked really well. I think it's sort of horses for courses, but it was interesting that there was a focus on the timing being an issue, and someone somewhere decided it needed to be quarterly, but the people at the coalface, if you like, felt like they spent all their time doing surveys and not enough time actually doing anything with it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a strange time of flux, Jo. Are annual employee surveys still relevant? Yes, absolutely. Are lots of people still doing them? Yes, absolutely. Is it culturally right for some organisations to do an annual survey? Absolutely. I'm sitting here as someone who's running annual surveys as we speak, including for the NHS. But is there still a place for annual surveys? Yeah, absolutely. Some organisations' culture means that this kind of process and acting on the findings, it is like an annual. It does take months and months to turn around a ship kind of thing. And so for those organisations, that's absolutely fine. I think the other issue there is internal resources. So as I say, quite often an annual survey is in the purview of one person within HR who it's the 103rd thing on their list of things to do that month or that quarter. We just have to not expect that there's suddenly going to be a huge team of people internally working on this stuff to enable you to do anything more frequent. The flip side of that, okay, I guess, is large corporate global organisations which will and do have large colleague insight teams for whom there is a requirement to do more often and more current and more cutting edge stuff. So
I realise this is going to be like a big question with a very long answer, which is not what I'm expecting, because obviously we do have limited time. but how do you go about determining the best way to survey for an organisation? Is it about the size? Is it, as you say, the size of the team that are doing it? Is it about the culture? Is it about what they're going to do with it at the end of it? And therefore, if they've got a certain way of dealing with it and they don't need that information, but they do need that information. Where do you start with an organisation that says we want to find out about engagement in our organisation and do something about it?
Okay.
See what I mean? Big question.
Yeah. It's lucky we've got 3.5 hours to talk, isn't it? Excellent. I'll start now.
That's right.
No, there is. I guess the much shorter answer is there is no one size fits all on this stuff. Having a bespoke response to companies based on what they're asking for and listening to their requirements is what seems to be working best. So for me, that's kind of come down to two ways of doing it. The first is that large organisations are speaking to us and saying, we're doing a big annual employee survey. We have to wait 2 months to get the results. We don't really do anything with it. It costs us X amounts of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Can you do anything more nimble and smart and quick? Okay, so that's kind of one area where where there's change. The second one is, I guess, to speak to a new client or someone with an open mind who says, we don't really know what we want to do, but we want the following list of things. And the kind of 4 golden things that we're finding that people want are, they still want that consultancy and support. They still want to hear from people who know what they're talking about. So I'm very nervous about some of the new apps and companies out there who are saying, run your own DIY engagement thing. Go away and do it. There's no support. It's X amount per quarter per employee kind of thing. And that's, I don't think that's particularly a good way of doing things, but then I would say that, wouldn't I? But clients still need a level of consultancy and support. So that's the first thing. The second thing that they want is beautiful technology. So having seen the beauty parades from companies who traditionally run annual employee surveys, they look like something from the 90s. There's never any care really given to how processes run, how sign-up processes run, how the survey looks, or how, are there interactive digital dashboards? Are there infographics? Why are you still using pie charts? Friends don't let friends use pie charts. Why haven't you got infographics like the rest of your communications? Why doesn't your advertising campaign look like an advertising campaign rather than someone printing out a Word document saying have your say on it, And so I guess there's an expectation now that there's a professionalism and that stuff's been ramped up a level. The third thing that people are looking for is more frequent feedback. Why should you do not ask your customers once a year what they think of you? So why on earth would you do that with your employees? People, as I say, are just much more used to giving frequent feedback, as long as it's done in a non-intrusive, low-level, low-touch, I guess, kind of way. If you're able to do that and people are happy to do that, then that's what you should be doing. I think, again, with the frequency and the speed of turnaround, people are looking for instant results as well. So when I used to have employee surveys run for companies that I was working for, I'd have to wait 6 weeks for the results, and that kind of thing is no longer acceptable. So that frequency thing is very important. And I guess the actionable, the fourth and final one is the making it actionable, making it insightful, and making it actionable. That's helped by quick turnaround, by consultancy and support. But way too often I've seen examples and frankly been responsible for projects which have had no real actionable insight. So those are the 4 things that people are looking for, and the regularity of that is going to be defined by the culture of the company.
Yeah. It's interesting just picking on the frequency one, especially as we're talking about sort of annual surveys as well. I talked in the past about an example of an organisation where I know they do a regular survey, and I can tell you when it is because my friend tells me that they've suddenly started having team meetings in the sort of 2 or 3 weeks leading into the survey that don't normally happen. And that's one of the things that I get asked about in the survey. And in some ways you sort of think actually creating a survey on a more frequent basis should hopefully have a knock-on effect that some stuff just happens more often because it's being checked on more often, if you like, which is a bit of a blunt way of improving engagement with an organisation. But some of that stuff that got left for 9 months because people forgot about it after the survey, before the next survey came along, sort of thing. I mean, in some ways that's gone away just from increasing the frequency, hasn't it?
Yeah, you'd be surprised how often that happened. I would say, and especially from my agency days, it's the minority of cases where it's actually dealt with well internally, and that's probably why there's been a bit of a call to move away from them, or at least change them, because it was essentially, to all intents and purposes, it was quite often pointless. And I'm saying that as someone who's spent my whole life doing them. So yeah, the frequency thing is interesting, and I think what we're seeing now is what we'd ideally like to create is a kind of virtuous cycle of feedback where people want to take part and people see the results, and they don't need to have team meetings before it's going live, because they've already seen and been communicated to what happened from the previous poll and what's going to happen next. And so to move away from a kind of a push to a pull, I suppose, in terms of participation, and for it to be a tool that enables a two-way communication between the management and employees, which is very different from the annual survey, and much more modern and progressive, and much more what I would hasten to say young people, but more what young people want and expect.
Well, it's interesting as well. One of our interviews, about 2 years ago now, I think, talked about. Do you remember the Tesco thing about you said, we did? Mm-hmm. And he said in their organisation they took that model, but they made it we said and we did, because he was saying, the you said we did was a bit like, you fill out your survey results, answers, and tell us what's wrong, and then as managers and leaders we'll run around trying to fix it all, and then we'll come back and ask you if we fixed it, which in itself makes it very them and us, and not the whole organisation working together. And just that one thing, he said, made a massive difference in that organisation. And I talk about it quite often when I'm speaking on engagement, and people are frantically scribbling that down. And it's such a small thing, but as you say, it's that thing which is about us together dealing with a situation, rather than making it about sort of managers and employees, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key things to get across in communications, that it's a collective. It's a conversation. There is always going to there's always going to be an element of them and us with management and other employees, but you can be smart and minimise that.
Yeah. So we've only got, say, sort of 5-6 minutes left of the interview. So talk a bit about the sort of types of questions and how you ask questions and how that's changed over the years.
Sure. I mean, what people are asking for in annual surveys is pretty much remains the same. People always ask what model of engagement we use, and I guess the answer is an amalgamation of all of the other ones that are out there, but bespoke and fit to your organisation. What I'm increasingly seeing, especially in HR analytics, and especially in more data-driven HR insights, is a move towards an NPS style of measurement around engagement. It's a bit. Some people disagree with it, but having a couple of questions around advocacy, which largely define and determine levels of engagement, seems to be what people are moving towards. When you're doing frequent short polls, when you're not asking 60 questions, you're not asking 40 questions, but maybe you're asking 6 or 7 or 10. Yeah, absolutely. A couple of advocacy questions to define engagement, a few questions around the hot topics of the moment. So, for example, we do monthly polls for Boots, and towards the end of last year, we needed to get some insight around the Christmas campaign, very key for retail organisations. So we asked questions specifically around that. And then the other thing, and this is a technology issue, I guess, is around the open-ended questions. So people love them, and people are increasingly moving away from what's seen as a relatively antiquated tick box process, and people want to have more freedom to say what they want to say. And we're developing technology that allows for instant theming of open comments and instant reporting. So almost like trending on Twitter. That's the kind of thing that we're moving towards. So if you have an online real-time dashboards and you can see what people are saying and it's trending like trends on Twitter, that's a world away from asking questions which require junior researchers to sit in basements and code by hand and get the results 6 weeks later, which is what previously happened. Indeed, I was one of those research monkeys sitting in a basement doing that coding. So I know how pointless and time-consuming it is.
And as you say, it just makes it so much more collaborative. And I love the idea of asking about the sort of retail campaign and things, because that's making the surveying, the research within the organisation so much broader. It's not just, are you happy working here type stuff. It's enabling you to really engage with and really draw out that employee voice that we talk about so much within the movement.
Absolutely, I think that's really important as well. Measuring engagement over short periods of time is often a hiding to nothing, really. If you do one annual survey 1 year and one the next year, the golden rule that I was always taught was, if that's moved 5%, that's a story, and if it's moved 10%, that's a real story. So what we're talking about, if you're doing a monthly poll, is a movement of 0.5% or 1% in employee engagement. Is that really worth measuring month on month? Probably not. It needs to be pertinent, and it needs to be relevant, and it needs to provide insight aside from engagement, which is actually interesting to the people who are taking part and useful to the people who are doing it. And those two things were often overlooked in annual surveys. You're absolutely right, though. Where this stuff works really well is things like retail, FMCG, fast-moving industries where that kind of timely insight's really important. You're right, for something like the NHS, do they need to do something more than annually? Probably not. Indeed, I do some of their annual surveys, so it's still obviously really useful for them. As I say, it depends on the organisation. There's no one size fits all, and each company will have a system that works for them.
So we're just coming to the last couple of minutes. So, is the annual engagement survey dead? One line.
Yes and no. I think it's dead. I think it's dead for large organisations which are fast moving and have internal resources to properly handle regular insight. I think for slow moving, perhaps more public sector or organisations with smaller HR teams or no HR team, then it's still really useful. And I'm sure it will continue for many years. But organisations who use the advantage of getting more regular employee insight will be ones who thrive and survive.
Interesting stuff. Our challenging title there. I'm challenged with a yes and no. But yeah, as you say, it's got to be bespoke to the organisations. But it's interesting that, as you say, it also comes down to internal resource at the end of the day, because that's a big part of it too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a case of, what do you want to do? What do you want? Why are you doing this? What do you want to do this for? Is it just an HR exercise that you have to do each year? Are you actually that concerned about what your people think of, I don't know, internal communications or managers? And do you need that measurement? And or would you rather make it part of a conversation and a feedback cycle, which you can actually use to adapt the culture and improve the business machinations of the organisation? And increasingly, people are taking that second route. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you for joining me, Peter. It's been really interesting exploring the topic, and maybe you'll come back again in a year or two and tell us what's happened then.
I will do that, exactly. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you. So just so you know, next week the other Jo is back. I feel I've been here for weeks. Jo Moffat's going to be interviewing Tom Griffin, who's a behavioural strategist and storyteller from the Fourth Wave, in an interview entitled Journey into the Circus of the Mind. So I'm looking forward to listening into that one. See you next time, or speak to you next time.
Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.